Vivian, we need to talk about your unrealistic expectations, Chelsea said, her surgically perfected lips curving into a cold smile. Tyler and I have decided it's time you found your own place. Your constant interference in our marriage is becoming toxic. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my son's modest kitchen, watching my daughter-in-law's new face deliver words that cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation was startling. 6 months ago, Chelsea had been a pretty but ordinary young woman, with soft features and kind eyes. Now sitting at my kitchen table in a designer outfit that cost more than my monthly pension, she looked like a completely different person. Her nose was razor sharp, her cheekbones unnaturally high, her lips so inflated they barely moved when she spoke. Even her body seemed different, enhanced in ways that defied nature. My son Tyler sat beside her, avoiding my eyes as he had for weeks now. At 28, he'd always been my gentle boy, the one who called me every Sunday and brought me groceries when my arthritis flared up. But the man sitting across from me seemed like a stranger, his shoulders hunched with what I could only describe as defeat. "Mom," he said quietly, still not meeting my gaze. "We think it would be better if you had your own space, for your independence." I'd been living with them for 8 months, ever since my landlord had sold my apartment building and I couldn't afford the rent increases elsewhere on my fixed income. Tyler had insisted I move in, said it would be temporary until I could find something suitable for someone my age. Chelsea had seemed supportive then, even enthusiastic about having me around to help with household tasks and cooking. "I see," I said, setting down the cup of coffee I'd been holding. "And where exactly do you suggest I go? My financial situation hasn't changed." Chelsea's new face attempted what might have been sympathy, but the extensive work made her expressions look artificial, almost sinister. "Vivian, there are senior communities, assisted living facilities. Places where you'd be around people your own age instead of trying to relive your glory days through Tyler's life." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Relive my glory days. I'd spent the last 8 months cooking their meals, cleaning their house, doing their laundry, and babysitting their finances while they both worked. I'd never once interfered in their relationship decisions, never criticized Chelsea's choices, even when those choices became increasingly bizarre. "I've never interfered in your marriage," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've tried to be helpful, supportive." "Supportive?" Chelsea laughed, a sound that used to be warm and genuine, but now seemed manufactured. "You hover constantly, you question every decision we make. Yesterday you actually asked me why I needed another procedure when I already looked perfect." I remembered that conversation differently. I'd simply noticed the appointment card on the counter for something called a Brazilian butt lift, and had commented that she was naturally beautiful. I'd meant it as a compliment, but apparently, she'd taken it as criticism. "Chelsea," I said carefully. I was trying to be kind. "You're a lovely young woman. I just worry about all these surgeries. They seem excessive, and they must be expensive." Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, her carefully constructed facade slipped. "There it is, the real issue. You think I'm wasting Tyler's money on myself instead of saving it for your care." Tyler finally looked up, and I was shocked by what I saw in his face. Dark circles under his eyes, a tension in his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. My successful, confident son looked like he was drowning. "Mom, please," he said, "just give us some space. I'll help you find a place, cover the deposit, whatever you need." But Chelsea's right, this arrangement isn't working anymore. I looked around the kitchen where I'd prepared hundreds of meals over the past months, where I'd sat with Tyler during his divorce proceedings 2 years ago, where I'd held him when he cried about feeling like a failure. The same kitchen where Chelsea had thanked me just last month for helping them get back on their feet financially. "How long do I have?" I asked. 2 weeks should be enough time," Chelsea said, already standing as if the conversation was over. "I'm sure you understand, Tyler and I are building a life together, and we need privacy to work on our relationship without outside judgment." Outside judgment. As if caring about my son's well-being and noticing his obvious distress constituted interference. As if asking reasonable questions about financial priorities made me a meddling mother-in-law. I watched them leave the kitchen together, Chelsea's hand possessively on Tyler's arm, her artificially enhanced figure moving with an odd, unnatural gait that suggested even more procedures I hadn't noticed. Tyler glanced back once, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach clench with worry. It wasn't just sadness or guilt. It was fear. That night, I lay in the guest room that had been my sanctuary for 8 months, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The conversation had felt rehearsed, as if Chelsea had been planning it for weeks. Her arguments had been too polished, too cruel to be spontaneous. And Tyler's compliance seemed forced, like he was reading from a script he didn't believe in. I thought about the changes I'd witnessed over the past 6 months. It had started small, a nose job that Chelsea had said was to fix a deviated septum. Then came the lip fillers, just a subtle enhancement she'd claimed. But the procedures had escalated quickly after that. Breast augmentation, liposuction, facial contouring, and procedures I couldn't even identify. Each surgery had been accompanied by elaborate explanations about self-improvement and confidence building. Chelsea had become obsessed with social media, constantly taking selfies and comparing herself to influencers and reality TV stars. She'd started speaking differently too, adopting phrases and mannerisms that seemed borrowed from the celebrities she followed online. But it was the financial aspect that worried me most. Tyler worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, making decent money, but nothing extravagant. Chelsea had been between jobs for months, claiming she was finding herself and exploring her options. Yet somehow, they'd afforded procedures that I knew cost tens of thousands of dollars. When I'd gently asked about their budget during one of our family dinners, Tyler had changed the subject quickly, but not before I'd seen that same fearful expression cross his face. Chelsea had jumped in with talk about investment in their future and building her brand, whatever that meant. Now, lying in the darkness with 2 weeks to find a new place to live, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My son was miserable, that much was obvious. But he was also trapped somehow, going along with decisions that were clearly destroying him financially and emotionally. I'd raised Tyler to be responsible with money, to think carefully before making major decisions, to prioritize practical concerns over superficial desires. The man I'd seen at dinner tonight bore little resemblance to the son I'd raised. He seemed hollowed out, like someone going through the motions of a life that no longer belonged to him. The next morning, I started looking for apartments, but my heart wasn't in it. Every listing within my budget was either unsafe, unsuitable for someone my age, or had waiting lists months long. I'd been out of the rental market for years, and the prices shocked me. Even with Tyler's promised help with a deposit, I wasn't sure how I'd manage monthly rent payments that had doubled since I'd last apartment hunted. But more than my housing situation, I was worried about leaving Tyler alone with Chelsea. Something about her transformation, both physical and emotional, set off every maternal instinct I had. The sweet, somewhat insecure young woman who'd married my son had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone whose priorities seemed fundamentally different from the values Tyler had been raised with. Over the next few days, I watched them more carefully, trying to understand the dynamic that had developed between them. Chelsea dominated every conversation, made all the decisions about their social calendar, and seemed to have complete control over their finances. Tyler had become passive, agreeable to the point of being a doormat, agreeing with everything she said even when it contradicted his previously stated opinions. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner, Chelsea announced they were planning a trip to Brazil for her next procedure, something she called a mommy makeover even though they didn't have children. Tyler's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth, and he'd stared at his plate for a long moment before nodding and saying it sounded like a great opportunity. "How much will that cost?" I'd asked, unable to stop myself. Chelsea's response had been immediate and sharp. "That's really not your concern, Vivian. Tyler and I make our financial decisions together, as married couples do." But Tyler hadn't looked like someone making joint decisions. He'd looked like someone who'd given up fighting battles he couldn't win. The week before I was supposed to move out, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been helping with laundry, as I had for months, when I'd noticed Tyler's wallet had fallen out of his pants pocket. I'd picked it up to return it to him, but it had fallen open, revealing something that made my blood run cold. The wallet was completely empty, no cash, no credit cards, nothing but his driver's license, and a single debit card for an account I didn't recognize. This was my son who'd always carried emergency cash, multiple credit cards, and at least 3 different bank cards for various accounts he'd set up for different financial goals. I'd stood there holding that empty wallet, remembering the Tyler who'd shown me his investment portfolio just a year ago, proud of the money he'd saved for a house down payment and retirement. The same Tyler who'd helped me understand my own finances after his father died, who'd set up automatic savings transfers, and taught me about compound interest. That night, I'd lain awake thinking about everything I'd observed over the past months. The expensive procedures, the designer clothes, the constant talk about investments and building her brand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The way Chelsea had insisted on handling their finances, claiming she was better at budgeting and planning. The way Tyler had gradually stopped talking about his work, his goals, his future plans. By morning I knew I couldn't just move out and hope for the best. Something was happening to my son, something that went beyond marital problems or generational differences. Chelsea's transformation hadn't just been physical, she'd become someone entirely different, someone whose priorities and values seemed fundamentally at odds with the life Tyler had been building before he met her. I'd spent 30 years as a nurse before retiring, and I'd seen enough troubled relationships to recognize the signs of financial abuse. The isolation from family, the control over resources, the way the victim gradually loses confidence and autonomy, while the abuser gains more power and control. But I'd never imagined I'd see those patterns in my own son's marriage, or that the abuser would be someone I'd welcomed into our family, with open arms. Chelsea had seemed so sweet when Tyler first brought her home, so appreciative of his stability and kindness. She'd talked about wanting a simple life, about being tired of the superficial world she'd come from. Now watching her examine her reflection in every mirror, constantly adjusting and posing, and photographing herself, I wondered if that sweet insecure girl had ever really existed, or if it had all been an act designed to hook a reliable man with good financial habits. The day before I was supposed to leave, Tyler came home from work looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Chelsea was out, getting what she called maintenance on her latest procedures, and for the first time in weeks we were alone in the house together. "Mom," he said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "I'm sorry about all this, I know it seems sudden, but Chelsea thinks it's for the best." I sat down across from him, studying his face. Up close, I could see how much weight he'd lost, how his clothes hung loose on his frame. "Tyler, are you happy?" The question seemed to surprise him. He opened his mouth to give what I suspected would be an automatic positive response, then closed it again. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to tell me about his troubles and trust me to help him solve them. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't really remember what happy feels like anymore." My heart broke for him, but I kept my voice calm. "Do you want to talk about it?" He looked toward the door, as if afraid Chelsea might walk in. "I can't. It's complicated. And Chelsea's right about you needing your own space. You deserve independence, not to be taking care of us all the time." But even as he said the words, they sounded hollow, like he was repeating something he'd been told rather than expressing his own feelings. I reached across the table and took his hand, noticing how thin his fingers had become. "Tyler, you know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what's happening, no matter how complicated it is, I'm your mother, that doesn't change." For a moment, I thought he might break down and tell me everything. His eyes filled with tears, and his hand tightened around mine, but then we heard Chelsea's car in the driveway, and he pulled away, wiping his eyes quickly. "I have to go help her with her bandages," he said, standing up. "The recovery from this procedure is more complicated than the others." Others, plural. I wondered how many procedures there had been, how much money had been spent, how much debt they'd accumulated in pursuit of Chelsea's ever-changing vision of perfection. As I watched him hurry to meet his wife, I made a decision that would change all our lives. I wasn't going to abandon my son to whatever was happening in this marriage. I was going to find out exactly what Chelsea had done with their money, and I was going to find a way to help Tyler before it was too late. That night, I started making phone calls to old nursing colleagues who'd worked in plastic surgery clinics, to financial advisors who might be able to give me guidance, to legal aid organizations that helped families dealing with financial abuse. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to try. Tyler was my only child, the center of my world since his father died when he was just 12. I'd raised him to be strong, independent, and capable of making good decisions. The broken man I'd been living with for the past months wasn't the son I'd raised, and I refused to believe that this was who he'd chosen to become. Something or someone had changed him, and I suspected that someone was sleeping in the master bedroom, probably planning her next procedure, while my son lay awake worrying about how to pay for it. Chelsea might have won this battle, getting me out of their house and away from their daily life. But she was about to discover that she'd underestimated a mother's determination to protect her child. I had 2 weeks to find a new place to live, but more importantly, I had 2 weeks to start unraveling whatever web of manipulation and control had trapped my son. And I was going to use every day of those 2 weeks to gather the information I needed to set him free. The morning I was supposed to move out, I loaded my few belongings into my old Honda Civic and drove to the extended stay motel on the other side of town. It wasn't ideal, but it was clean and affordable on a weekly basis, while I figured out my next steps. More importantly, it was close enough to Tyler's neighborhood that I could keep an eye on things without being accused of interference. Chelsea had been sickeningly sweet during my final breakfast in their house, talking about how proud she was of me for taking this step toward independence. She'd even offered to help me decorate my new place, as if we were the best of friends, rather than adversaries in an undeclared war for Tyler's well-being. Tyler had hugged me goodbye, with an intensity that confirmed my suspicions. He didn't want me to leave, but he felt powerless to stop it. As I'd driven away, I'd seen him standing in the doorway, looking lost and alone, despite being married to a woman who claimed to love him. The motel room was depressing, but I tried to think of it as a temporary command center rather than a permanent home. I spread my research materials across the small table and got to work. Over the past week, I'd compiled a list of questions that needed answers, starting with the most basic one: exactly how much money had Chelsea spent on her transformation? I'd called several plastic surgery clinics in the area, claiming to be interested in similar procedures for myself. The quotes I'd received had been staggering. A nose job alone could cost anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000. Breast augmentation ran between $10,000 and $20,000. The Brazilian butt lift Chelsea had mentioned could cost $30,000 or more. Based on what I'd observed, Chelsea had undergone at least 6 major procedures in the past year, plus numerous smaller treatments for maintenance and touch-ups. Even at the low end of the price ranges, she'd spent well over $100,000, possibly much more. Where had that money come from? Tyler made good money, but not enough to casually spend 6 figures on cosmetic surgery while maintaining their normal lifestyle. They'd been talking about buying a house before Chelsea's transformation began, and Tyler had been proud of the down payment fund he'd accumulated over several years of careful saving. I suspected that down payment fund was long gone, along with Tyler's retirement savings, emergency fund, and possibly much more. The empty wallet I'd seen suggested they might be living on credit, or worse, borrowing money from sources that could put Tyler in real danger. My second major question was about Chelsea's background. I'd accepted her story about being between jobs and exploring her options, but now I wondered if there was more to it. Had she ever had a stable career? Did she have her own financial resources, or had she been dependent on Tyler from the beginning? Tyler had always been attracted to people who needed help, a trait that had served him well in his career, but made him vulnerable to manipulation in his personal life. I wondered if Chelsea had recognized that vulnerability and exploited it from the start. My research into cosmetic surgery had revealed another disturbing pattern. Many people who underwent multiple procedures suffered from a condition called body dysmorphic disorder, a mental health issue that caused them to become obsessed with perceived flaws in their appearance. The disorder often led to an endless cycle of surgeries, each one promising to fix problems that existed primarily in the patient's mind. People with this condition could become addicted to the surgery process itself, chasing an ideal of perfection that could never be achieved. They often spent their life savings and went into massive debt, pursuing procedures that didn't actually improve their self-esteem or quality of life. If Chelsea was suffering from this disorder, it would explain her transformation from the sweet, modest woman Tyler had fallen in love with, into someone obsessed with her appearance and willing to spend unlimited amounts of money pursuing an impossible ideal. It would also explain Tyler's helplessness in the face of her demands. But it didn't excuse the financial abuse or the way she'd manipulated him into isolation from his support system. Mental illness might explain her behavior, but it didn't make the damage she was causing any less real or dangerous. I spent my first week in the motel gathering information and making plans. I drove by their house each morning and evening, noting when Tyler left for work and when Chelsea's various appointment cars arrived to pick her up. I followed her once to a medical spa, watching through the window as she consulted with staff about future procedures. The look on her face during that consultation had been disturbing. She'd examined herself in every mirror with an intensity that seemed almost frantic, pointing out flaws that were invisible to anyone else. The staff had seemed experienced in handling clients like her, nodding sympathetically and producing brochures for increasingly extreme procedures.
I'd also done some research into their financial situation, using my knowledge of Tyler's employment and previous financial habits to estimate their current status. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd feared. Based on public records, they'd refinanced their car twice in the past year, each time borrowing against its value. They'd opened multiple credit card accounts, most of which appeared to be maxed out. Tyler's careful investment portfolio had been liquidated, the proceeds probably used to fund Chelsea's surgical addiction. Most alarmingly, they'd taken out a second mortgage on the house Tyler had bought before their marriage, borrowing against equity he'd built up over years of responsible homeownership. That loan had a variable interest rate that would increase significantly over the next 2 years, potentially making their monthly payments unaffordable. They were headed for financial disaster, and Tyler seemed powerless to stop it. Every time he tried to object to a new procedure or express concerns about their spending, Chelsea apparently found a way to override his objections and get her way. By the end of my first week in the motel, I'd developed a plan. I needed to document the extent of their financial problems, gather evidence of Chelsea's manipulation and control, and find a way to present this information to Tyler in a way that would motivate him to take action. But I also needed to be careful. If Chelsea realized I was investigating their situation, she might accelerate her timeline or find ways to further isolate Tyler from potential help. I had to move slowly and carefully, gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of the obedient mother-in-law, who'd accepted her exile without question. The breakthrough came during my second week in the motel, when I was researching local plastic surgeons and found something that made my blood run cold. One of the clinics Chelsea had been visiting offered financing options for their procedures, including something called spousal co-signing for married clients. I called the clinic pretending to be interested in procedures for myself and asked about their financing options. The receptionist had been happy to explain that they worked with several companies that specialized in medical loans, often using home equity or other assets as collateral. Many of our married clients find it easier to qualify for larger loan amounts when both spouses are on the application, she'd explained cheerfully. It really opens up options for more comprehensive treatments. Both spouses on the application, which meant Tyler wasn't just passively allowing Chelsea to spend their money. His signature was on loan documents. His name was on contracts. His credit was being destroyed right alongside hers. The question was whether he understood what he was signing. Given his obvious distress and the way he'd changed over the past months, I suspected Chelsea had found ways to pressure or manipulate him into co-signing loans he didn't fully understand or want. That night, I made a decision that would either save my son or destroy any remaining relationship we had. I was going to find out exactly what kind of debt they'd accumulated, and I was going to confront Tyler with the evidence before it was too late to save him from complete financial ruin. But first I needed to get closer to their situation without arousing Chelsea's suspicions, and I thought I knew exactly how to do it. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. On Wednesday morning, I saw Tyler's car in the driveway at 9:30, which meant he'd called in sick to work. This was unusual for my son, who prided himself on perfect attendance and had used maybe 5 sick days in his entire career. I waited until I saw Chelsea leave in her Uber for what I assumed was another medical appointment, then knocked on the front door. Tyler answered looking terrible. His skin was pale and clammy, his hair unwashed, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd had on the day before. For a moment I wondered if he was actually ill, but then I saw his hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I left my blood pressure medication in the bathroom cabinet," I lied smoothly. "I called Chelsea yesterday but she must have forgotten. Can I just grab it quickly?" He hesitated for a moment, glancing back into the house, as if expecting Chelsea to materialize and object to my presence. Then he stepped aside and let me in. The house looked different. Not dirty exactly, but disorganized in a way that was completely unlike Tyler's usual fastidious standards. Mail was piled on the kitchen counter, dishes sat unwashed in the sink, and there were medical supply packages scattered across the dining room table. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, genuinely concerned about his appearance. "Just tired," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Chelsea had a complication from her last procedure. I've been helping her with the recovery process." I walked toward the bathroom, noting the prescription bottles lined up on the counter. Pain medications, antibiotics, anti-anxiety pills, all prescribed to Chelsea for various recent procedures. There were also supplements I didn't recognize, and what looked like hormone treatments. "That's a lot of medication," I observed. Tyler followed me down the hallway, wrapping his arms around himself, as if he was cold despite the house being quite warm. "The doctor says it's normal after the type of work she had done. She needed pretty extensive reconstruction." Reconstruction. The word sent a chill down my spine. Chelsea had looked perfectly normal when Tyler first brought her home. What kind of reconstruction could she possibly have needed? I retrieved my medication from the cabinet, but as I closed the mirror door, I caught sight of Tyler's reflection. He was staring at the floor with an expression of such profound despair that I almost gasped aloud. "Tyler, honey, talk to me. What's really going on?" For a moment I thought he might break down completely. His shoulders sagged, and he leaned against the doorframe as if he couldn't support his own weight. When he looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than his physical deterioration. It was hopelessness. "I can't," he whispered. "She'll know you were here. She always knows." The phrase sent alarm bells ringing in my head. She always knows. That wasn't the language of a healthy marriage. That was the language of surveillance and control. "Tyler, are you safe here?" The question seemed to surprise him. He blinked several times, as if he'd never considered his safety as something that might be in question. "I'm not in physical danger, if that's what you mean," he said finally. "But Mom, I think I'm losing my mind. I can't tell what's real anymore, what's reasonable, what's normal." She makes everything sound so logical when she explains it, but then when I'm alone, nothing makes sense. My nursing training kicked in. This sounded like gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation, where the abuser gradually makes the victim question their own perception of reality. It was insidious and incredibly effective, especially when applied consistently over time. "What kind of things is she telling you?" Tyler glanced toward the window, checking for Chelsea's return. "She says the surgeries are investments in our future. That once she builds her social media following and gets sponsorship deals, she'll make back everything we've spent and more. She has this whole business plan mapped out." "How much have you spent?" The question hung in the air between us. Tyler's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to confess his mistakes to me, knowing I'd help him figure out how to fix them. "I don't know exactly. She handles all the finances now because she says I don't understand the new economy, the influencer market. But Tyler, I think it's a lot. More than we can afford." More than they could afford was clearly an understatement. From what I'd observed and researched, they were drowning in debt, but Tyler seemed to have only a vague understanding of their actual financial situation. "Have you seen the credit card statements? The loan documents?" He shook his head. "Chelsea takes care of all that. She says it stresses me out too much to look at the numbers, and she's right. Every time I try to understand our budget, I get overwhelmed and make mistakes. She's much better at managing complex financial situations." The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. Chelsea had convinced Tyler that his natural concern about their spending was a personal failing, that his desire to understand their finances was a weakness rather than a responsible adult behavior. Tyler, you're an accountant. You manage complex financial situations for a living. That's different, he said, but he sounded uncertain. Those are other people's money, other people's businesses. Personal finance is more complicated because there are emotional factors involved. I recognized Chelsea's words coming out of Tyler's mouth. She'd planted these ideas so thoroughly that he was repeating them as if they were his own thoughts. When was the last time you looked at your bank account balance? Tyler was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally he said, I tried to check last month, but the login information had been changed. Chelsea said the bank recommended updating our security settings after some data breach, and she'd handled it to save me the hassle. My heart sank. Chelsea had cut Tyler off from access to his own financial accounts. This was financial abuse in its most blatant form, but Tyler had been conditioned to see it as helpful rather than controlling. Do you have access to any accounts? She gives me cash for gas and lunch, he said, his voice growing smaller, and she pays all the bills automatically so I don't have to worry about them. I was struggling to keep my voice calm and supportive, when everything in me wanted to shake Tyler, until he understood what was happening to him. Honey, don't you think it's important for both spouses to understand their financial situation? Of course, he said quickly. And Chelsea explains everything to me. It's just that she's better at the details, and with everything she's going through with the recovery and building her brand, it makes sense for her to handle the day-to-day management. Everything she's going through. Tyler had been programmed to see himself as secondary to Chelsea's needs, to view his own concerns and rights as less important than her goals and comfort. I heard a car door slam outside, and saw Tyler's whole body tense with what looked like genuine fear. She's back, he said, his voice barely audible. You need to go. Please, Mom. If she knows you were here asking questions, she'll be upset, and when she's upset, everything gets harder. I wanted to stay and confront Chelsea directly, to demand an explanation for what she'd done to my son. But I could see that Tyler was genuinely terrified of her reaction, and I didn't want to make his situation worse by creating a scene he'd have to deal with after I left. I'm going, I said, heading for the back door. But Tyler, I want you to know that you can call me anytime, day or night, if you need help, if you want to talk, if you just need someone to listen. I'm here for you no matter what. He nodded but didn't meet my eyes. I slipped out through the kitchen door, just as I heard Chelsea's key in the front lock. I sat in my car around the corner, shaking with anger and fear for my son. The conversation had confirmed my worst suspicions about Chelsea's control over Tyler, but it had also revealed the psychological dimension of the abuse. Tyler wasn't just being financially manipulated. He was being systematically broken down, his confidence destroyed, his ability to think clearly about his own life compromised. Chelsea had isolated him from his support system, cut him off from his own financial resources, and convinced him that his natural concerns were personal failings. This was more serious than I'd initially realized. Tyler wasn't just in financial danger, he was in psychological danger, and the longer this continued, the harder it would be for him to recover his sense of self and his ability to make rational decisions about his own life. I drove back to the motel with a new sense of urgency. I needed to move faster, gather more concrete evidence, and find a way to intervention before Chelsea's control over Tyler became so complete that he couldn't be reached at all. That afternoon, I called Tyler's bank using information I'd gathered from old documents I still had, from when I'd helped him set up his accounts years ago. I claimed to be calling about potential identity theft, expressing concern that someone might be accessing my son's accounts without permission. The customer service representative was helpful but limited in what she could share. She confirmed that there had been significant account activity recently, and that several accounts had been closed, or had their access permissions modified. She couldn't give me specific details, but she suggested that Tyler come in person with identification to review his account history and ensure his accounts were secure. I also called the credit monitoring service Tyler had used for years, using his social security number and mother's maiden name, to access his credit report. What I found there made me physically sick. Tyler's credit score had dropped from excellent to poor in just 8 months. He had 17 open credit accounts, most of which I'd never heard of. Many were medical financing companies that specialized in cosmetic surgery loans. The total debt listed was over $250,000. $250,000. My son, who'd been debt-free except for his modest mortgage just a year ago, now owed $250,000 to various lenders. Most of the debt was recent, accumulated in the past 6 months, as Chelsea's surgical procedures had escalated. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. 3 of the largest loans were secured against Tyler's house, meaning that if he defaulted on the payments, he could lose his home. The interest rates were astronomical, clearly designed to target desperate borrowers who couldn't qualify for traditional financing. I printed out the credit report and sat staring at the numbers, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Chelsea had done. Even if Tyler's salary had doubled, these debt payments would be unmanageable. They were headed for bankruptcy, foreclosure, and complete financial ruin. But Chelsea was still scheduling procedures, still spending money they didn't have on treatments that seemed to have no end point. She was like an addict who couldn't stop using, even when the consequences became life-threatening. I spent the rest of the day researching the lenders listed on Tyler's credit report. Most were legitimate companies, but several had concerning reviews and complaints about aggressive collection practices and unclear loan terms. A few had been investigated by state regulators for targeting vulnerable borrowers with predatory lending practices. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd gotten caught up in a cycle of surgical addiction and had dragged my financially responsible son down with her. But it was more than just poor decision-making. The systematic way she'd isolated Tyler from his finances and convinced him to doubt his own judgment suggested a level of manipulation that went beyond mere selfishness. I'd seen similar patterns during my nursing career, usually in cases involving domestic abuse or elder financial exploitation. The techniques were the same: isolation, gaslighting, financial control, and gradual erosion of the victim's confidence and autonomy. The difference was that Tyler was a capable, intelligent adult man who should have been able to recognize what was happening to him. The fact that he couldn't suggested that Chelsea was either very skilled at manipulation or that Tyler was more vulnerable than I'd realized. That evening, I called my old friend Margaret Rodriguez, who worked as a social worker specializing in domestic abuse cases. I explained the situation without using names, asking for her professional opinion about the dynamics I'd observed. "What you're describing sounds like classic financial abuse," Margaret said without hesitation. "The isolation from family, the control over finances, the gaslighting about normal concerns. It's actually more common than people realize, and it can happen to anyone regardless of their education or intelligence. But how does someone get so completely controlled?" Tyler used to be very independent, very confident about financial matters. Abusers are often very good at identifying and exploiting their victims' vulnerabilities. Margaret explained, they usually start small, with reasonable-sounding suggestions and helpful gestures. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, they're already isolated from their support system and doubting their own perceptions. "What can family members do to help?" "Document everything," Margaret said immediately. "Financial records, behavioral changes, any evidence of the abuse or control, but be careful not to confront the abuser directly, because that often makes things worse for the victim. The goal is to preserve the relationship with the victim and wait for an opportunity to offer help when they're ready to accept it. What if they're not ready? What if the financial damage becomes irreversible?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes you have to weigh the financial consequences against the psychological ones. If you push too hard too fast, you might save their credit score, but lose them entirely. And if they're not psychologically ready to leave the abusive situation, they'll just end up back in the same pattern with the same person or someone similar." The conversation left me feeling frustrated and helpless. I had evidence of what Chelsea was doing to Tyler, but apparently I couldn't use it effectively without risking further damage to my relationship with my son. I spent a sleepless night in the motel room, staring at the credit report and trying to figure out my next move. By morning I'd made a decision that would either save Tyler or cost me any chance of a relationship with him. I was going to gather more evidence, document everything I could find, and then present Tyler with undeniable proof of what his wife was doing to him. It was risky, but the alternative was watching him spiral into complete financial and psychological destruction, while I stood by helplessly. The next few days fell into a pattern. I followed Chelsea to various medical appointments, noting the clinics she visited and the frequency of her treatments. I researched the procedures she was having done, the costs involved, and the financing options available. What I discovered was disturbing beyond anything I'd imagined. Chelsea wasn't just having cosmetic procedures done locally. She was traveling to other states and even other countries for treatments that weren't available or legal in our area. Some of the procedures she'd undergone were experimental, with limited safety data and no guarantee of results. Others were revision surgeries to correct complications from previous procedures, creating an endless cycle of medical interventions that seemed to have no logical endpoint. The financial trail was equally alarming.
Chelsea had opened accounts with medical tourism companies that specialized in financing overseas procedures. She'd used Tyler's credit and assets as collateral for loans that funded not just her surgeries, but elaborate recovery vacations in luxury resorts. I found records of a trip to Colombia where she'd spent 3 weeks recovering from multiple procedures while staying in a high-end medical spa that cost more per day than most people spent on rent. Tyler had been listed as the financial guarantor for the entire package, including complications insurance and extended recovery care. The most shocking discovery came when I researched the social media presence Chelsea had been building. She had accounts on multiple platforms where she documented her surgical journey, posting before and after photos and promoting the clinics and doctors she'd used, but her follower counts were pathetic. Despite months of posting and thousands of dollars spent on professional photography and promotion, she had fewer than 3,000 followers across all platforms. The engagement on her posts was minimal, consisting mostly of comments from other plastic surgery patients rather than the mainstream audience needed for sponsorship deals. There was no business plan, no realistic path to the income Chelsea had promised Tyler. The entire social media strategy was a fantasy, a justification for unlimited spending on procedures that served no purpose other than feeding her own psychological need for physical modification. I printed out everything I could find: bank statements, credit reports, loan documents, medical bills, travel receipts, social media analytics. By the end of the week, I had a file folder 3 inches thick documenting the complete financial destruction of my son's life. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Tyler was not just in debt, he was financially ruined. His credit was destroyed, his assets were leveraged beyond any reasonable limit, and he was locked into payment plans that would take decades to resolve even if the spending stopped immediately. But the spending wasn't stopping. If anything, it was accelerating. Chelsea had appointments scheduled for the next 3 months, including another international trip that would cost $40,000 for a procedure that had a 30% complication rate according to medical literature. I couldn't wait any longer. Tyler needed to see this information, and he needed to see it before Chelsea's next procedure pushed them past the point of any possible financial recovery. I called Tyler's office and asked his secretary to have him call me about a family emergency. When he called back, I could hear the panic in his voice. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey, but we need to talk. Can you meet me for lunch today? It's important." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him calculating whether Chelsea would approve of an unscheduled meeting with me. "I don't know if I can get away," he said finally. "Chelsea has a follow-up appointment this afternoon, and she needs me to drive her." "Tyler, this is about your financial situation. I've found some things that I think you need to see." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What kind of things?" "Things that affect your future, your security, your ability to retire or buy a house or have any kind of financial stability. Please just give me an hour, 1 hour to show you what I've found." "Mom, you're scaring me." "I'm scared too, honey. That's why we need to talk." He agreed to meet me at a restaurant across town from his office, somewhere Chelsea was unlikely to see us together. As I drove to meet him, I rehearsed what I was going to say, how I was going to present the information in a way that would penetrate the psychological conditioning Chelsea had imposed on him. I arrived early and spread the documents across the table, organizing them in a way that would tell the story clearly and logically. When Tyler walked in, he looked around nervously before sitting down across from me. "What's all this?" he asked, staring at the papers. "This is your credit report," I said, sliding the first document toward him. "And these are the loan documents for debt you've accumulated in the past 8 months."
Tyler picked up the credit report and scanned it quickly. I watched his face as the numbers registered, saw the moment when the reality of his situation began to penetrate the fog of denial and manipulation he'd been living in. "This can't be right," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The total debt amount, it's impossible. We haven't borrowed anywhere near this much money. Look at the individual accounts," I said gently. "Do you recognize the lender names?" He studied the report more carefully, and I saw his hands begin to shake as he read down the list of medical financing companies and high-interest loan providers. Chelsea said we'd only used a few small loans to cover temporary cash flow issues. I pulled out the loan documents I'd managed to obtain. "These aren't small loans, Tyler, and they're not temporary. Some of these have 15-year repayment terms with variable interest rates that will increase every year." Tyler spread out the loan documents, his accountant's training taking over as he analyzed the terms and conditions. What he found there clearly shocked him. "These interest rates are criminal," he said, his voice rising slightly. "And these fees, these penalties for early payment, this is predatory lending. No responsible financial advisor would ever recommend loans like these." "Who arranged these loans, Tyler?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. "Chelsea handled all the applications," he said finally. "She said she'd researched all the options and found the best deals available for medical financing. She said the rates were competitive for this type of specialized lending." I pulled out the research I'd done on medical loan companies, showing him the legitimate lenders with reasonable terms and the predatory companies that targeted desperate borrowers. "These aren't competitive rates, honey. These are the kind of loans that companies offer to people with terrible credit who have no other options. But your credit was excellent when this started. You could have qualified for much better terms if you'd applied through conventional lenders." Tyler studied the comparison charts I'd prepared, and I could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been done to him. "She told me the conventional lenders didn't understand the cosmetic surgery market," he said slowly. "That we needed specialized companies that were familiar with this type of investment." "Investment in what, exactly?" Tyler looked up at me, and for the first time since this conversation started, I saw a flicker of the analytical thinking that had made him successful in his career. "She said the surgeries were an investment in her social media career, that once she built her following, she'd be able to get sponsorship deals and endorsement contracts that would more than pay back what we'd spent." I pulled out the social media analytics I'd compiled, showing Chelsea's actual follower counts, engagement rates, and earning potential based on industry standards. "Tyler, look at these numbers. Even if Chelsea's following doubled tomorrow, she wouldn't be eligible for the kind of sponsorship deals that could support this level of debt. Most influencers need millions of followers to generate substantial income, and that takes years to build even with professional management and marketing support." Tyler stared at the social media data for a long time, cross-referencing it with the loan amounts and repayment schedules. I could see him doing calculations in his head, his professional training finally overriding the psychological manipulation he'd been subjected to. "The numbers don't work," he said quietly. "Even in the best-case scenario, even if everything went perfectly with her social media plans, we'd never generate enough income to justify this level of debt." "Tyler, there's more." I showed him the records of Chelsea's international travel, the luxury recovery packages, the experimental procedures that had no medical necessity. I showed him the trail of revision surgeries designed to fix complications from previous procedures, creating an endless cycle of medical interventions. "Some of these procedures she's planning," I said carefully, "they have serious complication rates. And each complication leads to more surgeries, more expenses, more debt. There's no endpoint to this cycle." Tyler was quiet for a long time, studying all the documents I'd brought. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there in months. "Mom," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since this conversation started. "I think I need help." Those 4 words changed everything. For the first time in months, I heard my real son speaking, not the confused, manipulated version Chelsea had created. The fog of gaslighting was lifting, and Tyler was beginning to see his situation clearly. "What kind of help do you need?" I asked carefully, not wanting to overwhelm him, or push too hard too fast. Tyler rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to process difficult information. "I don't even know where to start. Financial help, legal help, maybe psychological help. I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my own life for months. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We'll figure it out together. But first I need to ask you something important. Are you ready to stand up to Chelsea? Because once we start taking action to fix this situation, she's going to fight back, and it won't be pleasant. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, staring at the loan documents scattered across the table. When he looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in his eyes for almost a year: determination. I have to. If I don't stop this now, I'll lose everything. My house, my career, my future, maybe even my sanity. He paused, then added quietly, I think I've already lost myself. We spent the next hour developing a plan. Tyler would immediately contact his bank to regain access to his accounts and put a freeze on any new credit applications. He would schedule appointments with a financial advisor and a lawyer who specialized in debt resolution. Most importantly, he would confront Chelsea about the true extent of their debt and demand that all medical procedures stop immediately. What if she refuses? Tyler asked. What if she says I'm being controlling or unsupportive? Then you'll know for certain that this relationship is about her needs, not yours, I said gently. A loving partner would be horrified to learn they'd put you in this kind of financial danger. They'd immediately want to work together to fix the problem. Tyler nodded, but I could see he was still struggling with the idea of confronting the woman he'd married. I keep thinking about how she used to be. Sweet, considerate, grateful for everything I did for her. I don't understand how she became this person who could destroy my life without seeming to care. Maybe she was always this person, I suggested. Maybe the sweet, grateful version was an act designed to hook someone stable and financially secure. Or maybe the surgical addiction changed her brain chemistry. Either way, the person you're living with now is dangerous to your well-being. We agreed that Tyler would start making calls that afternoon, while Chelsea was at her follow-up appointment. He would gather information about his options before confronting her, so he'd be prepared for whatever her reaction might be. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Tyler grabbed my arm. Mom, thank you. I know I've been horrible to you these past months, choosing her over you, letting her convince me that you were the problem. I'm ashamed of how I treated you. You were being manipulated by someone who's very good at it, I said firmly. This isn't your fault, Tyler. You're the victim here, not the villain. But even as I said the words, I could see Tyler struggling with guilt and self-blame. One of the cruelest aspects of psychological abuse was how it made victims feel responsible for their own mistreatment. I drove Tyler back to his office, watching him walk into the building with more confidence than I'd seen in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hopeful. Tyler was awake now, aware of what had been done to him, and ready to fight back. That afternoon, I returned to my motel room and began researching Tyler's legal options. The debt was enormous, but if we could prove that Chelsea had forged signatures or misrepresented their financial situation to lenders, some of the loans might be challengeable. I also looked into the possibility of annulment rather than divorce. If Tyler could prove that Chelsea had entered the marriage under false pretenses, specifically to gain access to his financial resources, it might be possible to dissolve the marriage as if it had never legally existed. My phone rang around 4 o'clock. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. How did it go with the bank? Worse than I thought, Tyler said, his voice tight with stress. They wouldn't give me specific details over the phone, but they confirmed that someone had applied for a home equity line of credit last week using my information. The application is still pending approval. My stomach dropped. How much? $75,000. Mom, if that loan goes through, I could lose the house. The total debt against the property would be more than it's worth. Did you put a freeze on your credit? Yes, and I've scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor for tomorrow morning. But Mom, there's something else. When I called the bank, they said Chelsea had been there twice this week, asking about increasing the credit limit on accounts I didn't even know existed. The predatory behavior was escalating. Chelsea wasn't just maintaining her current spending level, she was actively seeking new sources of money to fund additional procedures. She was like an addict, who needed bigger and bigger fixes to achieve the same high. Tyler, you need to confront her tonight, before she finds another way to access credit or applies for more loans. Every day you wait makes the situation worse. I know, he said, but I could hear the fear in his voice. I'm just not sure how to do it. How do you tell someone you love that they've destroyed your life? You start with the truth, I said. You show her the documents, explain what you've learned, and ask her to get help for her addiction. Give her a chance to acknowledge what she's done and commit to stopping. And if she won't, then you protect yourself. You file for separation, you take legal action to prevent her from accessing your credit, and you start the process of rebuilding your life. Tyler was quiet for a moment. Will you be there? Not in the room, but nearby, in case I need support. Of course. Where do you want to meet? We arranged that I would wait in the parking lot of a coffee shop near their house. Tyler would call me after the conversation to let me know how it went. If Chelsea reacted badly, or if the situation became dangerous, I'd be close enough to help. I spent the evening researching domestic violence resources and financial abuse support services. I printed out information about counseling services, legal aid organizations, and emergency housing options. I wasn't sure what Tyler would need, but I wanted to be prepared for any outcome. At 7 o'clock, I drove to the coffee shop and parked where I could see Tyler's house in the distance. The lights were on, and both cars were in the driveway. I settled in to wait, my phone in my hand and my heart pounding with anxiety about what might happen. Tyler's call came 2 hours later. His voice was shaky, and I could tell he'd been crying. It's over, Mom. The marriage, everything. She's not the person I thought I married. What happened? Are you safe? I'm safe. I'm sitting in my car in the driveway. I can't go back in the house right now. Come to the coffee shop. We'll talk here. 10 minutes later, Tyler walked into the coffee shop looking like he'd aged 10 years in one evening. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and his hands were shaking as he sat down across from me. Tell me what happened. Tyler took a deep breath, gathering himself before he spoke. I showed her all the documents you'd given me. The credit report, the loan statements, everything. At first she tried to dismiss it, said I was overreacting and that she had everything under control.
But when I pressed her for specifics, when I asked her to explain how we were going to pay back $250,000 in debt, she got angry, really angry. She started screaming that I was unsupportive, that I didn't understand her vision, that I was trying to sabotage her career. I waited for him to continue, sensing there was more. Then I asked her about the home equity application, the one the bank told me about. And Mom, she didn't deny it. She said she needed the money for a procedure that couldn't wait. Something about correcting a complication from her last surgery. $75,000 to correct a complication. Tyler nodded miserably. When I asked her which procedure and what kind of complication, she got evasive, started talking about how I wouldn't understand the medical details, how I needed to trust her judgment about her own body. So I did something I should have done months ago. I called the clinic directly, with Chelsea sitting right there, and asked them about this complication that required $75,000 to fix. I leaned forward, sensing we were getting to the heart of the story. There is no complication. The $75,000 isn't for corrective surgery. It's for something called a total body transformation package that includes multiple procedures she wants to have done simultaneously. The words hit me like a physical blow. Chelsea hadn't just been lying about their finances. She'd been lying about medical necessity to justify continued spending on elective procedures. What did you say to her? I asked her to explain why she'd lied to me about needing corrective surgery when she was actually planning more cosmetic procedures. And that's when she said something that made me realize I don't know this person at all. Tyler paused, struggling with the memory. She said that I was too small-minded to understand that this was an investment in our future, that successful influencers needed to maintain their image with regular updates and improvements. She said I was holding her back from achieving her potential because I was obsessed with money instead of supporting her dreams. Then she said something that really shocked me. She said that if I couldn't appreciate what she was trying to build, maybe I didn't deserve to be part of her success story. The narcissism was breathtaking. Chelsea had twisted the situation so completely that Tyler's reasonable concerns about financial ruin were reframed as jealousy and lack of support for her imaginary career. How did you respond? I told her I wanted to see our bank statements for the past year, all of them. I wanted to understand exactly where every dollar had gone and what our actual financial situation was. And, Tyler's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She refused. She said it would upset me to see the numbers, that I was too emotionally fragile to handle the details of her business investments. The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost comical, except for the devastating effect it had had on Tyler's sense of reality. That's when I knew for certain that everything you'd shown me was true.
A loving spouse doesn't refuse to share financial information. A business partner doesn't hide investment details from their cosigner. She's been treating me like a fool, and I let her do it. You're not a fool, Tyler. You're a victim of someone who's very skilled at manipulation. Maybe, but I should have seen it sooner. The signs were all there. The way she cut me off from you. The way she convinced me I couldn't handle our finances. The way she made me feel guilty for asking reasonable questions. We sat in silence for a moment while Tyler processed everything that had happened. What's your next step? I asked. Tomorrow I'm meeting with the financial advisor, and I've made an appointment with a divorce attorney for Friday. I'm also going to talk to my employer about our employee assistance program. I think I need counseling to understand how I got so completely manipulated. I was proud of Tyler for taking charge of his situation, but I was also worried about the practical realities he was facing. Where are you going to stay tonight? I booked a room at the hotel near my office. I can't go back to the house until I've talked to a lawyer about my rights and how to protect myself financially. What about Chelsea? How did she react when you said you were leaving? Tyler's expression darkened. That's the scariest part. She didn't seem upset at all. She seemed annoyed, like I was inconveniencing her by questioning her plans. When I said I was leaving, she just shrugged and said I'd be back once I realized I couldn't survive without her. The casual dismissal of Tyler's distress was chilling. Either Chelsea was so completely delusional that she couldn't perceive the seriousness of the situation, or she was so narcissistic that she genuinely believed Tyler would return no matter how badly she treated him. Tyler, I want you to be very careful. People like Chelsea don't react well when they lose control over their victims. She might try to manipulate you into coming back, or she might escalate to more extreme behaviors. What kind of extreme behaviors? Threats, sabotage, attempts to damage your reputation or career, financial revenge, like maxing out credit cards or applying for loans in your name. Sometimes people in her situation become genuinely dangerous when they realize their source of funding is gone. Tyler paled at the implications. I never thought of Chelsea as dangerous. You never thought of her as a liar or a thief either, but she's both. When someone is willing to destroy your financial life for their own gratification, you can't predict what else they might be willing to do. We talked for another hour, developing a plan for Tyler to protect himself while he sorted out the legal and financial mess Chelsea had created. He would change all his passwords, alert his employer to potential issues, and document everything in case he needed evidence later. Most importantly, he would have no contact with Chelsea except through attorneys once the divorce proceedings began. The psychological hold she'd had over him was broken, but Tyler was still vulnerable to manipulation, especially if she appealed to his memories of who she used to be. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Tyler hugged me with an intensity that reminded me of his childhood. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. "I know I hurt you when I chose her over you, when I let her convince me that you were the problem. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." "You don't need to apologize for being victimized," I said firmly. "You need to focus on healing and rebuilding. The rest will work itself out." But even as I spoke the words, I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Tyler faced financial ruin, emotional trauma, and the challenge of rebuilding his life from scratch. And Chelsea wasn't going to disappear quietly. She still had access to credit in Tyler's name, still had possession of their shared home, and still had powerful psychological tools she could use to try to regain control over him. The battle was just beginning, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for how ugly it might get. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Tyler. My heart racing, I called him back immediately. "Mom, she's lost her mind. Completely lost her mind." "What happened?" "I went to the house this morning to get some clothes and personal items. I thought she'd be at her appointment, but she was there, and Mom, she'd done something horrible to herself." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "She'd gone to some back alley clinic last night after our fight. She had some kind of procedure done to her face. It's swollen and bruised and bandaged, but I could see enough to know that something went terribly wrong." "Is she okay? Does she need medical attention?" "That's just it, she refuses to go to a hospital. She says the swelling is normal, that I'm overreacting because I don't understand cosmetic surgery." "But Mom, this doesn't look normal. This looks like she's been in a car accident." I felt sick thinking about what Chelsea might have done to herself in a fit of rage or desperation. "Where did she have this procedure done?" "I don't know. She won't tell me." When I asked, she said it was none of my business since I'd made it clear I didn't support her choices. Tyler, you need to call 911. If she's had a botched surgery and won't seek proper medical care, she could be in serious danger. I tried. She threatened to file a restraining order against me if I called for medical help against her wishes. She said I was trying to sabotage her recovery out of spite. The situation was spiraling beyond anything I'd imagined. Chelsea's behavior had crossed from financial abuse into self-destructive actions that could threaten her life. What did the financial advisor say? Tyler's voice was grim. It's worse than we thought. The debt total is actually closer to $300,000. When you include the accounts Chelsea opened that haven't shown up on credit reports yet. Some of the loans have personal guarantees that make me responsible even if we divorce. $300,000. The number was so staggering, I couldn't immediately process it. Is there any way to challenge the debt? Maybe some of it. The lawyer I'm seeing today specializes in cases involving financial fraud and forgery. He thinks we might be able to prove that Chelsea misrepresented our income and assets on some of the loan applications. But even if we can discharge half the debt, I'm still looking at financial ruin. Bankruptcy, foreclosure, damaged credit for years. And that's assuming Chelsea doesn't find new ways to access money in my name. I closed my eyes, trying to think of solutions. What about the house? Is there any equity left? Not much. Between the original mortgage and the equity loans Chelsea took out, there's maybe $20,000 in actual equity. But the lawyer said that if we're forced to sell quickly, we probably won't net anything after realtor fees and closing costs. The conversation was interrupted by a call from an unknown number that Tyler needed to take. He called me back 10 minutes later, his voice even more strained. That was the clinic where Chelsea went last night. They want her to come in immediately for emergency follow-up care. Apparently she had some kind of reaction to whatever they did, and they're concerned about infection. Did you tell them she refused medical attention? Yes, and they said they might have to report it to authorities if she doesn't come in voluntarily. The procedure she had wasn't supposed to be done without weeks of preparation and medical clearance. The recklessness of Chelsea's actions was breathtaking. She'd risked her life to spite Tyler, to prove some twisted point about her autonomy and his lack of support. Tyler, you need to distance yourself from this situation immediately. If Chelsea is making dangerous medical decisions and refusing proper care, you can't be responsible for the consequences. But what if she dies? What if whatever she did to herself last night kills her? Then that's a choice she made, not something you caused. You can't save someone who's determined to destroy themselves, especially when they're also destroying you in the process. It was a harsh truth, but Tyler needed to hear it. He'd spent months trying to save a marriage to someone who was systematically ruining his life. Now he needed to focus on saving himself. The lawyer wants to see me in an hour, Tyler said. He's going to start drafting emergency petitions to freeze our joint accounts and prevent Chelsea from accessing any more credit in my name. Good. And Tyler, I want you to consider staying somewhere other than that hotel near your office. If Chelsea decides to escalate her behavior, she knows where to find you there. You think she'd actually try to hurt me? I think she's proven that she's capable of anything. Someone who would risk their life in a back alley clinic to spite their spouse is someone who's lost touch with reality. You can't predict what she might do next. We agreed that Tyler would come stay with me at the motel until he could find a more permanent solution. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep him safe while he dealt with the legal and financial aftermath of his marriage. That afternoon, Tyler moved his belongings into my motel room. He looked exhausted, emotionally drained from the confrontation with Chelsea and the realization of how completely his life had been destroyed. I keep thinking about the money, he said as we sat on the narrow beds eating takeout dinner. $300,000. That's more than I make in 5 years. Even if I work until I'm 70, I'll never recover from this debt. You will recover, I said firmly. It'll take time and sacrifice, but you're young and you have skills that are in demand. The debt is manageable if you approach it systematically. But the opportunity cost, Mom. I should be saving for retirement, building equity in a home, maybe starting a family someday. Instead, I'll be paying for Chelsea's surgical addiction for the next decade. I understood his despair, but I also knew that dwelling on the lost opportunities would only deepen his depression and delay his recovery. Tyler, right now you need to focus on 2 things. getting legally separated from Chelsea so she can't cause any more financial damage, and developing a plan to address the existing debt. Everything else can wait until you've stabilized your situation. Tyler nodded, but I could see he was struggling with guilt and self-recrimination. I should have seen this coming. The warning signs were all there. Abusers are skilled at hiding their true nature until their victims are too invested to leave easily. Chelsea probably started planning this manipulation from the moment she met you. You really think it was all calculated? That she never loved me at all? It was a painful question, but Tyler needed to face the possibility that his entire marriage had been built on deception. I think Chelsea is incapable of loving anyone more than she loves herself. Whether she intended to destroy your finances from the beginning, or just got caught up in her surgical addiction doesn't matter. The result is the same. Tyler was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I'd said. The lawyer thinks we can get an emergency court order to prevent her from accessing any more credit, he said eventually. But he also warned me that she'll probably fight the divorce proceedings. People like Chelsea don't give up their financial resources easily. What kind of fight? She might claim that I was abusive or controlling, that I prevented her from pursuing her career, that she deserves alimony or a share of my future earnings. The lawyer said financial abusers often position themselves as victims when their behavior is exposed. The thought of Chelsea portraying herself as the wronged party was infuriating, but I wasn't surprised. People who were capable of systematic manipulation were also capable of rewriting history to suit their needs. Can she actually get alimony after what she's done? Possibly. The courts don't always consider financial abuse in alimony decisions, especially if Chelsea can convince a judge that her spending was for legitimate medical reasons. We spent the evening researching Tyler's legal options and preparing for the court hearing scheduled for the following week. The emergency petition would ask the judge to freeze all joint accounts, prevent Chelsea from applying for additional credit, and require her to account for every dollar she'd spent during their marriage. As we worked, I couldn't help but think about how quickly Tyler's life had changed. Just 48 hours ago, he'd been a confused, manipulated man trapped in an abusive marriage. Now he was taking decisive action to reclaim his autonomy and rebuild his future. The transformation gave me hope that Tyler would eventually recover from this experience, but I also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Extricating himself from Chelsea's financial web would take months or years, and the psychological healing would take even longer. At 11 o'clock, Tyler's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then immediately handed the phone to me. "She's threatening to hurt herself if I don't come home," he said, his voice shaking. "She says I've driven her to desperation, that if something happens to her, it'll be my fault." I read the text message, which was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation.
Chelsea was using the threat of self-harm to guilt Tyler into abandoning his plans and returning to their destructive dynamic. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," I said. "She's escalating because she's losing control. You cannot respond to this message." But what if she actually hurts herself? What if she's serious? If she's serious about self-harm, she needs professional help, not reinforcement of her manipulative behavior. Responding to threats like this only teaches her that manipulation works. Tyler stared at his phone, clearly torn between rational thinking and emotional reaction. "So I just ignore it. What if I wake up tomorrow and find out she's dead? Then that's a choice she made, not a consequence of your actions." "Tyler, you can't be held hostage by threats of self-harm. That's another form of abuse, and giving into it will only make things worse." But I could see that Tyler was struggling with the decision. His natural compassion and the psychological conditioning he'd endured made it almost impossible for him to ignore Chelsea's apparent distress. "There is one thing we can do," I said finally. "We can call for a welfare check. If you're genuinely concerned about her safety, we can ask the police to go to the house and make sure she's okay." Tyler nodded gratefully. "Yes, let's do that. At least then I'll know she's safe, but I won't be rewarding her threats by going back." I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher was professional and understanding, noting that welfare checks in domestic situations were common. Officers would go to the house within the hour to ensure Chelsea was safe and didn't need immediate medical attention. 2 hours later, Tyler received a call from one of the responding officers. Chelsea was physically fine,
though they'd noted signs of recent medical procedures that might require follow-up care. She'd been advised to contact a medical professional if she experienced any complications. "Did she seem mentally stable?" Tyler asked. The officer said she appeared coherent but agitated. "She complained that you were harassing her and threatened to file a restraining order if you contacted her again." The threat of a restraining order was another manipulation tactic, designed to make Tyler back down from his divorce plans out of fear of legal consequences. "Your lawyer needs to know about this," I said. Threatening restraining orders to silence a spouse who's discovered financial abuse is a common tactic. Tyler made a note to call his attorney first thing in the morning. As we prepared for bed, I could see that the day's events had taken a toll on him. He looked exhausted and overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation he was facing. "Mom," he said as we turned off the lights, "I'm scared, not of Chelsea, but of what my life is going to look like when this is all over. I don't know how to rebuild from this level of destruction." "One step at a time," I said gently. "Tomorrow we focus on the legal proceedings. Next week we'll work on the financial planning. Everything else can wait until you've dealt with the immediate crisis." But as I lay in the darkness listening to Tyler's restless sleep, I wondered if either of us truly understood how difficult the road ahead would be. Chelsea had done more than steal money. She'd shattered Tyler's confidence, destroyed his financial security, and left him questioning his own judgment about everything. Rebuilding from that kind of devastation would require more than legal remedies and financial planning. It would require Tyler to completely reconstruct his sense of self and his ability to trust his own perceptions. And somewhere across town, Chelsea was planning her next move, probably confident that Tyler would eventually return to her out of guilt, loneliness, or sheer inability to navigate the mess she'd created. She was about to discover that she'd underestimated both Tyler's determination and a mother's willingness to fight for her son's future. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Tyler had spent the weekend preparing with his attorney, gathering documentation and rehearsing his testimony about Chelsea's financial deception. I could see the stress eating away at him, but there was also a new strength in his posture, a determination that hadn't been there during the months of manipulation. "She'll be there," Tyler said as we drove to the courthouse. "Her attorney called mine yesterday to say they'd be contesting everything. They're claiming I was aware of all the spending and that I'm now trying to escape responsibility for jointly made decisions." The courthouse was intimidating, all marble floors and echoing hallways. Tyler's attorney, David Chen, met us outside the courtroom. He was a small, intense man with steel-gray hair and the demeanor of someone who'd fought these battles many times before. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, shaking my hand, "Tyler's told me how instrumental you've been in uncovering the extent of the financial abuse. We may need you to testify about what you observed." I nodded, though the thought of facing Chelsea in court made my stomach clench with anxiety. I'd been avoiding her for weeks, but now I'd have to look her in the eye while describing how she'd systematically destroyed my son's life. When we entered the courtroom, Chelsea was already seated at the defendant's table with her attorney. The transformation in her appearance was shocking. The swelling from her most recent procedure had gone down, but something about her face looked fundamentally wrong, asymmetrical. Her left cheek was noticeably higher than her right, and her smile, when she turned to acknowledge Tyler, was lopsided and unsettling. "Dear God," Tyler whispered. "What did she do to herself?" Her attorney was a woman in her 40s with expensively styled hair and a designer suit that probably cost more than Tyler made in a month. She looked like exactly the kind of lawyer someone would hire when money was no object, and winning was the only acceptable outcome. The judge was Honorable Patricia Martinez, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, who had a reputation for no-nonsense proceedings and little patience for frivolous litigation. She reviewed the emergency petition quickly, then looked up at both legal teams. "This petition requests immediate freezing of joint accounts and prevention of further credit applications. Mr. Chen, please present your evidence." What followed was 90 minutes of methodical presentation of financial records, credit reports, and loan documents. David Chen walked the court through each fraudulent application, each forged signature, each instance, where Chelsea had misrepresented their income or assets to secure financing. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing cash advances that Tyler had never authorized. Credit card applications with forged signatures. Loan documents where Tyler's income had been inflated by 40% to meet lending requirements. Your Honor, David said, holding up a particularly damning document. This application for a $60,000 medical loan shows Mitchell's salary as $95,000 annually. His actual salary, as confirmed by his employer, is $68,000. The defendant clearly falsified income information to secure financing that my client could not legitimately afford. Chelsea's attorney, Sarah Hendricks, objected to much of the evidence, claiming that Tyler had been aware of and complicit in all financial decisions. But when pressed for documentation supporting this claim, she could provide nothing beyond Chelsea's assertions. When it came time for testimony, Tyler took the stand first. He spoke clearly and calmly about the gradual erosion of his access to financial information, the way Chelsea had convinced him that his concerns were neurotic and controlling. She made me feel like I was being unreasonable for wanting to understand our budget, Tyler said. Every time I asked questions about our spending, she'd tell me I was stressing unnecessarily, that she was protecting me from financial anxiety by handling everything herself. Mr. Mitchell, the judge asked, did you ever authorize your wife to apply for credit in your name without your knowledge? No, Your Honor. I specifically asked her several times to involve me in any major financial decisions. She assured me that she would, but as these documents show, she was applying for loans and credit accounts without my knowledge or consent. When Chelsea took the stand, her testimony was a masterclass in manipulation and deflection. She portrayed herself as a victim of Tyler's psychological abuse, claiming he'd been controlling and demanding. Tyler isolated me from my friends and family, she said, her voice trembling with apparent emotion. He made me feel like I couldn't make any decisions without his approval. The surgeries were my way of reclaiming my autonomy and building confidence after years of being diminished. It was a compelling performance, and I could see some sympathy in the judge's expression. But David Chen was prepared for this strategy. Miss Mitchell, he said, during cross-examination, if Mr. Mitchell was so controlling about your decisions, how were you able to undergo 17 separate surgical procedures and accumulate $300,000 in debt without his knowledge? Chelsea's facade cracked slightly. He knew about the procedures. He just didn't understand that they were business investments. Business investments in what specifically? My social media career. I was building a following as a beauty and lifestyle influencer. David pulled out the analytics I'd helped gather. According to these reports, your total following across all platforms is fewer than 3,000 people. Industry standards suggest that influencers need a minimum of 100,000 engaged followers to generate significant income. How exactly was this a business investment? Chelsea's answer was rambling and incoherent, full of buzzwords about building her brand and investing in her future earning potential. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that there had never been a realistic business plan, just a series of justifications for unlimited cosmetic spending. The most damaging moment came when David presented evidence of the most recent loan application, the one for $75,000 that Chelsea had submitted the day after Tyler confronted her about their debt. Miss Mitchell, this application was submitted after your husband had already expressed concerns about your debt level and explicitly asked you to stop taking on new financial obligations. Can you explain why you felt it was appropriate to apply for additional financing against his clearly stated wishes? Chelsea's response revealed the depth of her delusion and narcissism. Tyler doesn't understand the influencer industry. If I'd waited for his approval, I would have missed opportunities. Sometimes you have to make executive decisions for the good of the business. What business? You just testified that you had fewer than 3,000 followers and no sponsorship deals. Chelsea's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Chelsea had essentially admitted that she'd ignored Tyler's explicit objections and continued borrowing money for procedures that had no realistic chance of generating income. When the judge called for recess, Tyler looked emotionally drained, but cautiously optimistic. I think it went well, he said. She couldn't explain away the financial evidence, and her testimony made her sound delusional. David nodded agreement. The judge is clearly skeptical of Miss Mitchell's claims. I think we'll get the emergency order, but I want to prepare you for what comes next. This was just the first battle. The divorce proceedings will be much more complex. Judge Martinez returned with her decision 30 minutes later. She granted the emergency petition in its entirety, freezing all joint accounts and placing a hold on Tyler's credit that would prevent any new applications. She also ordered Chelsea to provide a complete accounting of all spending during their marriage and appointed a neutral financial monitor to oversee any asset transfers. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of financial abuse that threatens Mr. Mitchell's economic security, Judge Martinez said. Until this matter can be fully adjudicated, the court will not permit any further erosion of the marital assets. Chelsea's reaction to the ruling was swift and ugly. As we left the courtroom, she followed Tyler into the hallway, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed off the marble walls. "You think you've won something," she screamed. "You think ruining my life makes you feel like a man. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Tyler stood calmly in the face of her fury, and I was proud of how composed he remained. "Chelsea, please get help. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about stopping destructive behavior before it destroys both of us. I don't need help. I need a husband who supports my dreams instead of sabotaging them out of jealousy." The delusion was complete. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of her own financial abuse, Chelsea still saw herself as the victim and Tyler as the villain. Security officers had to escort Chelsea from the building after she refused to stop screaming at Tyler. As we watched her leave, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Tyler was finally free from her manipulation, but sadness for the broken woman who destroyed so many lives in pursuit of an impossible ideal. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Chelsea's deception became clear as the court-ordered financial analysis proceeded. The debt total reached nearly $400,000 when hidden accounts and undisclosed loans were factored in. Chelsea had been running what amounted to a sophisticated financial fraud operation, using Tyler's credit and assets to fund an increasingly expensive surgical addiction. The forensic accountant found evidence that Chelsea had been planning her financial strategy from early in their relationship. She'd researched Tyler's income and credit score before their marriage, had specifically targeted him because of his financial stability and trusting nature. She didn't just fall into this behavior, the accountant explained to Tyler and his legal team. This was systematic and premeditated. She identified you as an ideal target and systematically gained access to your financial resources. The revelation that his entire marriage had been built on deception was devastating for Tyler. He went through a period of deep depression, questioning his judgment about everything, and struggling with shame about how completely he'd been manipulated. "I feel like such an idiot," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "How could I not see what she was doing? How could I be so blind to someone I was supposed to know better than anyone?" "Because she was very good at it," I replied. "And because you're a decent person who assumes other people share your values. That's not a character flaw, Tyler. That's what makes you a good man." The divorce proceedings took 8 months to complete. Chelsea fought every aspect of the settlement, demanding alimony, and claiming that Tyler owed her compensation for the emotional trauma of their failed marriage. But the evidence of financial abuse was too overwhelming for any court to ignore. In the end, Tyler was able to discharge about 60% of the debt by proving that Chelsea had forged signatures and misrepresented their financial situation to lenders. The remaining debt was substantial but manageable with careful budgeting and aggressive payment planning. Chelsea received nothing in the divorce settlement. The court found that her financial abuse constituted marital misconduct that barred her from any claim to Tyler's assets or future earnings. The last I heard of Chelsea, she was facing criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. Several of the lenders she'd defrauded had filed complaints, and the district attorney's office had decided to prosecute her case as an example to other potential financial abusers. Tyler slowly rebuilt his life, though the process took years. He moved into a modest apartment and began the long journey of paying down his debt while saving for his future. He also started therapy to address the psychological trauma of the abuse and to rebuild his confidence in his own judgment. "I'm actually grateful for the experience," he told me 2 years later, as we celebrated his debt reaching the halfway point to being paid off. It taught me to trust my instincts and to never again ignore red flags in relationships. Tyler eventually began dating again, but he was much more cautious about financial boundaries and much better at recognizing manipulative behavior. He'd learned to value partners who were financially independent and emotionally stable, rather than being attracted to people who needed rescuing. As for me, I moved into a small but comfortable apartment near Tyler's place. The crisis had brought us closer together than we'd been since he was a child, and I treasured our regular dinners and weekend visits. I also became involved with a local organization that helped victims of elder abuse and financial exploitation. My experience with Chelsea had taught me how sophisticated and devastating financial abuse could be, and I wanted to help other families recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Looking back on that terrible year, I'm struck by how much we all grew from the experience. Tyler learned to set boundaries and trust his own judgment. I learned that sometimes protecting the people you love means being willing to fight battles they can't fight for themselves. And Chelsea, I sometimes wonder what became of her after the criminal charges and the civil judgments. I hope she eventually got the mental health treatment she needed, though I suspect she's more likely moved on to another victim. The most important lesson from our ordeal was that financial abuse thrives in silence and secrecy. The moment Tyler was willing to face the truth about his situation and accept help from people who cared about him, Chelsea's power over him evaporated. It took time, sacrifice, and considerable legal expense, but Tyler eventually reclaimed his life and his future. And our family, though scarred by the experience, emerged stronger and more united than ever before. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their self-destruction, even when they beg you to look the other way. Tyler's recovery began the moment someone who loved him was willing to speak the uncomfortable truth about what was really happening in his marriage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.